To understand the man who would define reason for 2 millennia, we must first look beyond the walls of Athens. Aristotle was not born to the political and social privileges of the city-state that would host his greatest work. He was a foreigner, a man whose earliest influences were not the abstract geometry of the academy, but the tangible, measurable, living world of biology and medicine. This unique starting point is the single most important key to unlocking his entire philosophy, a philosophy deeply rooted in observation, classification, and the relentless pursuit of fact. The place of birth: Aristotle was born in 384 BC in the coastal city of Stagira, a Greek colony and port town. This location, situated on the edge of the Greek world in Chalcidice, meant he grew up outside the traditional intellectual centers. The designation stagirate is often used to identify him, a constant reminder of his non-Athenian origins. A non-Athenian citizen. This birthplace meant that throughout his decades of residence in Athens, Aristotle remained an alien resident, known as a metoikos. He was never granted the political rights of an Athenian citizen. This distance from the intense political machine of the city-state may have ironically fostered the objective, detached perspective that characterizes his scientific and political analyses. The physician father, Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was a figure of significant importance. He served as the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon, the powerful figure who was grandfather to Alexander the Great. This esteemed familial connection immediately placed Aristotle within the orbit of the powerful Macedonian royal court, a connection that would prove both beneficial and eventually dangerous. The legacy of observation. His father's profession had an indelible foundational impact on the philosopher's mind. While Plato, coming from a noble political background, was drawn to the purity of mathematics and abstract concepts, Aristotle began his intellectual life immersed in the empirical observation required by medicine, dissection, diagnosis, and the careful study of living organisms. This early scientific training is the deep root of his philosophy's distinct earthly character. Orphaned early. Both of Aristotle's parents died when he was still quite young. This early loss led to his being raised by a guardian named Proxenus of Atarneus, who ensured that the boy, despite his early misfortune, received the highest quality education, managing his inheritance and preparing him for the great intellectual centers of the Hellenic world. The journey to the academy. At the pivotal age of 17, around 367 BC, Aristotle left his home region and traveled to Athens to complete his education. He immediately enrolled in Plato's Academy, the institution founded by Plato a generation earlier, which stood as the world's first formal, systematic university. The 20-year disciple, the depth of his commitment is astounding. Aristotle remained at Plato's Academy for a staggering period of 20 years, dedicating 2 full decades of his life to studying under the master, until Plato's death in 347 BC. During this time, he moved from being the diligent student to the most intellectually respected and rigorous colleague within the Academy's walls. Plato's nickname for Aristotle, the intellectual brilliance of the young Macedonian, was undeniable, even to the idolist Plato. Plato reportedly referred to Aristotle as the mind of the school, nous, recognizing his exceptional critical thinking power, or sometimes the reader, a nod to his meticulous study habits and his dedication to acquiring and cataloging every existing scroll of knowledge. The seeds of disagreement. Despite the duration of their association, the intellectual partnership eventually fractured over a fundamental issue, the theory of forms. While Plato held that the perfect essence, the form of a thing, exists separately in a non-physical, transcendent realm, Aristotle began to argue that the true essence of a thing exists immanently, or within the thing itself. The iconic image, this profound philosophical conflict, is perhaps best visualized in the famous detail from Raphael's fresco, The School of Athens. Plato is shown pointing upward toward the heavens, seeking the ideal realm of the forms, while Aristotle gestures downward toward the ground, symbolizing his commitment to the physical, observable world as the source of true knowledge. The question of the universal. Their divide centered on the problem of universals, the existence of shared properties, like redness or justice. For Aristotle, the concept of a universal is derived only by meticulously observing and collecting data on many individual, particular things or acts. The universal, ousia, is embedded in the physical object, not separated from it. The first major break, the death of Plato in 347 BC, marked the end of an era and the beginning of Aristotle's independence. Surprisingly, the leadership of the academy passed to Plato's nephew, Speusippus, rather than to the intellectually dominant Aristotle. This decision, possibly stemming from political friction or philosophical divergence, was the catalyst for Aristotle's departure from Athens shortly thereafter. Travels in Asia Minor. After leaving the city, Aristotle spent several years traveling and residing in Asia Minor, particularly in the small coastal kingdom of Assos. Here he continued his philosophical work and critically began his most extensive zoological and biological research, expanding his meticulous collection of data on marine life and other animals in the Aegean region. His first wife. While living in Assos, Aristotle married Pythias, who was the adopted daughter of Hermias, the local ruler and a former academy student. This marriage further integrated him into the political world and solidified his social status in the Greek political landscape, the birth of a daughter. Aristotle and Pythias had one child together, a daughter whom they also named Pythias. The philosopher's family life was, in contrast to Plato's radical proposals for the communal family life of his guardians, quite traditional and structured. The Macedonian call, a defining opportunity, arose in 343-342 BC, when Aristotle received an invitation from the powerful King Philip II of Macedon. He was asked to undertake a role of immense historical importance, to serve as the personal tutor to Philip's young son, the future conqueror Alexander the Great, who was then only about 13 years old. Tutoring Alexander. Aristotle devoted several key years to tutoring Alexander at the secluded sanctuary of the nymphs in Mieza. His instruction was encyclopedic, covering ethics, politics, rhetoric, and a deep appreciation for poetry, especially the works of Homer. This intimate mentorship became one of the most consequential teacher-student relationships in the history of the world. The gift of Homer. As a symbolic and educational gift, Aristotle famously provided Alexander with a special, annotated copy of Homer's Iliad. Alexander reportedly treasured this work, carrying it with him on all his subsequent military campaigns, viewing it as a guide to both heroism and effective leadership. The influence on conquest. While Alexander's ambitions ultimately exceeded his teacher's control, Aristotle's ethical and political teachings undoubtedly informed the prince's early vision, the dream of uniting the Greek city-states and exporting Hellenic culture across the known world, though Aristotle later criticized the conqueror's adoption of Persian customs and his shift toward absolute rule. The death of Pythias. During his time mentoring Alexander, Aristotle suffered the loss of his wife, Pythias. Aristotle later formed a lifelong domestic partnership with a woman named Herpyllis, who became the mother of his second child. The birth of Nicomachus. Aristotle and Herpyllis had a son, whom Aristotle named Nicomachus, in homage to his own father. This son's name is now immortalized as the title of Aristotle's most famous and influential ethical treatise, the Nicomachean Ethics, which is believed to be dedicated either to his son or his father. The return to Athens. After Alexander ascended the throne in 336 BC, Aristotle left Macedon and returned to Athens. The city was now firmly under Macedonian political control, a reality that ironically gave Aristotle the necessary political stability to establish his own school without the immediate threat of the persecution that had ended Socrates' life. The founding of the Lyceum. In 335 BC, Aristotle, now nearing 50, founded his own school in a public grove outside the city. It was named the Lyceum, taking its name from a nearby temple dedicated to Apollo Lyceus, Apollo the wolf god. The Peripatetic School. The Lyceum quickly earned the nickname the Peripatetic School. This name comes from the Greek word peripatoi, meaning covered walkways or walking around. This refers to Aristotle's unique teaching practice of engaging his students in discussion and instruction while walking leisurely through the colonnades and gardens of the school. The Lyceum versus the Academy. The Lyceum immediately distinguished itself as a rival to Plato's Academy. While the Academy maintained its Platonic focus on mathematics and abstract metaphysics, the Lyceum was built around empirical research, natural science, and systematic classification, embodying Aristotle's scientific temperament. The two types of lectures. Aristotle meticulously organized his intellectual output, separating his teaching into two distinct forms: exoteric, the public, popular lectures intended for a general audience, which are largely lost, and esoteric, the private, complex, technical lectures intended only for advanced students, from which the vast majority of his surviving works are derived. The foundation of Aristotle's life, his scientific lineage, his long apprenticeship to Plato, and his unique mentorship of a world conqueror culminated in the establishment of the Lyceum. This school became the engine for his monumental intellectual project, the systematization of knowledge itself. That project begins with the invention of the single most powerful tool of Western thought, logic. The study of how we think is the necessary first step before we can understand what we know. The architecture of thought, the invention of logic. The scientific eye of the young Aristotle recognized a fundamental problem. Before one could classify the physical world, one needed a reliable, objective tool to govern thought itself. His 20 years in Plato's Academy, steeped in Socratic dialogue and the rigorous quest for perfect definition, led him to an unparalleled breakthrough. He became the undisputed founder of formal logic, a system so profoundly complete that it defined the very structure of rational as scientific inquiry for over 2,000 years. The Organon. Aristotle's collection of works on logic are collectively known by the name Organon, a Greek term meaning instrument or tool. This name was applied by later scholars from the peripatetic school who understood that logic was not a branch of philosophy in its own right, but the essential methodological instrument that must precede all other philosophical and scientific inquiry. The study of inference. The primary specific focus of Aristotle's logic is the study of inference, the process of moving reliably and validly from one or more known premises to a new necessary conclusion. His system was concerned with the form or structure of the argument rather than the material truth of the initial statements. The categories. In his logical treatise, Categories, Aristotle established the 10 supreme kinds of things that can be affirmed or denied about any subject in existence. These fundamental categories, such as substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and passion, serve as the most basic ways we can organize and talk about reality. The invention of the syllogism. Aristotle's most significant, monumental logical invention is the syllogism. This is a specific, formal type of argument structure that consists of exactly 3 propositions: a major premise, a minor premise, and a necessary conclusion that follows from the first 2. The necessity of the conclusion. The power of the syllogism lies in its necessity. If the 2 premises are accepted as true, the conclusion cannot logically be false. The classic, often repeated example is, all men are mortal, major premise. Socrates is a man, minor premise. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, conclusion. The figures of the syllogism. Aristotle undertook an exhaustive analysis, meticulously cataloging all possible forms of the syllogism. He arranged them into 3 figures, which are defined by the position of the middle term, the term that appears in both premises but not in the conclusion. He cataloged all the valid combinations, known as moods, within these figures. The principle of non-contradiction. Aristotle established the principle of non-contradiction as the most fundamental, unassailable law of thought and of reality itself. This principle states that a single thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. He deemed it the most certain of all principles, incapable of being proven, because it is presupposed by all meaningful speech and thought. Logic as the foundations of science. Aristotle argued that all true scientific knowledge, episteme, must be based on demonstration, a formal, step-by-step chain of reasoning that moves from premises already known to be true, axioms, to conclusions that logically follow. Logic thus provides the essential scaffolding for the structure of science. The role of definitions. For Aristotle, a proper scientific inquiry must begin with a proper definition of its subject. A perfect definition, he argued, must state the genus, the larger class the thing belongs to, and the differentia, the unique trait that distinguishes it within that class. For example, man is a rational animal, where animal is the genus and rational is the differentia. Induction versus deduction. Aristotle recognized and analyzed the 2 essential primary paths of reasoning. Deduction, moving logically from general, universal truths to specific cases using the syllogism, and induction, moving from the repeated observation of specific particulars to the establishment of the general, universal principle. The primary substance. In his logical and metaphysical analyses, Aristotle makes a critical distinction between primary substance, the concrete, individual thing, e.g., the specific horse, and secondary substance, the universal category or species the thing belongs to, e.g., the concept of horse or animal. He maintained that only primary substance is fully and ultimately real. The doctrine of the predicables. Aristotle developed the doctrine of the predicables, which classifies the possible relationships between a subject, what we are talking about, and a predicate, what we are saying about it. Is the predicate a definition, a property, a genus, a difference, or an accident of the subject? This established the core analytical vocabulary for Western logic. The power of the a priori. Despite his strong commitment to empirical observation, Aristotle believed that the fundamental axioms of science, such as the laws of geometry or the principle of non-contradiction, are known a priori, known independently of sensory experience, because they are necessary structures of the mind and reality itself, and must be grasped by the intellect. The syllogism's longevity. The profound power and completeness of Aristotle's invention of the syllogism ensured that his system of logic remained the standard, unchallenged framework for deductive reasoning in the Western, Middle Eastern, and Byzantine intellectual traditions for over 2,000 years, enduring until the advent of modern symbolic logic in the 19th century. The invention of logic provided Aristotle with the necessary intellectual tool to dissect the entire world, leading him to his vast metaphysical explorations. Having defined how we think, he next turned his gaze to defining what everything is. The metaphysics of being, substance, causality, and potential Aristotle understood that the philosopher's task was to define the ultimate principles that govern all reality. His work on this topic, compiled later and called Metaphysics, is a direct, systematic rebuttal to Plato's transcendent idealism. Aristotle insisted that the principles of existence must be found here, in the physical, observable world. The meaning of metaphysics. The title Metaphysics was not the philosopher's own. It was a term coined by Andronicus of Rhodes, a scholar who edited Aristotle's works centuries later, meaning the things after the physics, to metaphysica, simply referring to the placement of these abstract treatises immediately following his books on nature. Aristotle himself referred to the subject as first philosophy, meaning the most fundamental science, the study of being as being. Aristotle defines the subject of metaphysics as the study of being as being, an examination of what existence itself means, abstracting from the particular qualities of specific things, like physics abstracts from change or mathematics abstracts from matter. It is the inquiry into the ultimate structure of reality. The centrality of substance, ousia. The most important concept in Aristotle's entire metaphysics is substance, ousia. Substance is the individual, independent thing that underlies all its properties. Everything else that exists is a property accident of a substance, and e.g., Socrates is white, Socrates is short. The substance itself is not a property of anything else. Form and matter. To explain the existence of any physical substance, Aristotle introduced the essential, necessary duality of form, morph, and matter, hyle. Matter is the potential, undetermined stuff, while form is the defining structure or essence that organizes the matter and gives it its specific identity. Every physical object is a combination, synelon, of the two. Immanent forms. This is where Aristotle permanently breaks with his master. Against Plato's transcendent forms, Aristotle argues that the form is immanent, It exists within the material thing itself. For instance, the form of a statue is its specific shape, which exists only in the bronze, the matter. The form and matter are inseparable, except as concepts in the mind. Potentiality and actuality. To fully explain change, motion, and generation, Aristotle developed the fundamental concepts of potentiality, dynamis, and actuality, energia. Potentiality is the inherent capacity a thing has to change or be realized, e.g., a seed is potentially a plant. Actuality is the full realization or fulfillment of that potential, e.g., the fully grown plant. Change is simply the movement from potentiality to actuality. Actuality is prior to potentiality. Aristotle argues that actuality is logically and temporally prior to potentiality. The existence of the potential, the seed, can only be understood by reference to the actuality that must precede it, the fully grown plant that produced the seed. Actuality is the ultimate purpose and goal of all development. The four causes. To fully understand any phenomenon or object in the world, to explain why it is, Aristotle asserted that we must identify its four causes, not reasons, but comprehensive explanatory factors that fully account for its existence and change. This structure remains one of his most influential contributions to scientific inquiry. The material cause? The material cause is the answer to the question, what is it made of? E.g., the bronze of a statue, the wood and nails of a bed. The formal cause? The formal cause is the answer to the question, what is its structure or essence? E.g., the shape of the statue, the design blueprint of the bed. This is the definition. The efficient cause. The efficient cause is the answer to the question, what force brought it into existence? E.g., the sculptor who shaped the bronze, the carpenter who assembled the wood. The final cause, teleology, the final cause, telos, is the answer to the question, what is its end, purpose, or function? E.g., the purpose of the statue is aesthetic pleasure, the purpose of the bed is sleep. This emphasis on intrinsic purpose makes his entire system teleological. The unmoved mover, introduction. Having established that all change is a movement from potentiality to actuality, Aristotle needed an ultimate source of all movement. This led him to posit the existence of a purely actual, perfect, eternal being, the unmoved mover. This entity is the ultimate final cause of all movement in the universe, an eternal source that is itself pure, unchanging actuality. The concept of the unmoved mover and the emphasis on the final cause will guide our next discussion as we move from the abstract structure of reality to the observable cosmos and the structure of nature. The cosmos and the natural world, physics, biology, and the ordered universe. Having established the architecture of thought through logic and the fundamental nature of existence through metaphysics, Aristotle turned his meticulous, scientific gaze to the world around him. His project was nothing less than to map the entire natural realm, moving from the perfect, eternal motions of the heavens down to the smallest, most complex details of animal life. His treatises on physics and biology defined our understanding of nature for over 1,000 years, cementing his legacy as the first true natural scientist. The unmoved mover as final cause. We previously established the unmoved mover as pure actuality. Crucially, this entity does not physically push or cause change in the world like a mechanical force. Instead, it causes movement as the object of desire, love, and aspiration. It is the ultimate final cause that inspires the perfect circular motion of the heavens, setting the entire cosmos in motion. The mover as pure thought. The activity of this ultimate source is defined as thought thinking itself, noesis noeseos. It is pure, eternal, and unchanging contemplation. Because it is perfect, it can only contemplate the most perfect object, itself. This contemplation is the highest form of existence, which all things in the cosmos strive to imitate. The eternity of the world. Unlike subsequent theological views, Aristotle definitively believed that the world was eternal. It had no beginning and will have no end in time. The sequence of movement and change, driven by the unmoved mover, has always been occurring, and the material cosmos has always existed as the recipient of this eternal movement. The rejection of the void. Aristotle rejected the theory of the atomists, who had posited the existence of a void or empty space. He argued vehemently that motion requires a continuous medium and that a perfect vacuum is physically and logically impossible. His famous summary of this belief is the statement that nature abhors a vacuum, horror vacui, a concept that influenced physics until the 17th century. The natural place. To explain all motion in the sublunary realm, the region beneath the moon containing the earth, Aristotle created the theory of natural place. He asserted that every element has an intrinsic tendency to move toward its rightful place in the universe. The elements and motion. This theory is based on the four earthly elements. Earth and water are heavy, tending to move naturally toward the center of the universe, the center of the earth. Air and fire are light, tending to move naturally upward, away from the center. Objects fall because they seek their natural place. The fifth element, ether. To account for the eternal, perfect, and circular motion of the celestial bodies, the planets and stars, Aristotle proposed a fifth element called ether, quintessence. This element was unique to the heavens, perfect, unchangeable, and incapable of the linear, transient motion found on Earth. The geocentric universe. Aristotle's cosmology was strictly geocentric. He held that the Earth stood motionless at the center of the universe, surrounded by a complex series of nested, crystalline spheres containing the sun, moon, planets, and fixed stars, all moving in perfect, eternal circles, driven by the love for the unmoved mover. The distinction between spheres. This cosmological model created an absolute separation between the perfect, eternal, and predictable celestial sphere made of ether and the imperfect, corruptible, and changing sublunary sphere made of the four traditional elements. The father of biology. Aristotle's true scientific passion lay in biology. His works on the natural world, including history of animals, parts of animals, and generation of animals, are the earliest known systematic scientific treatises in the West and earned him the title of the father of biology. Extensive research. During his travels in Asia Minor and his time at the Lyceum, Aristotle conducted immense, hands-on empirical research. He described and classified over 500 species of animals, often relying on dissection and meticulous observation, especially of marine life from the Aegean Sea. The scale of nature. Aristotle created the first known systematic biological classification system, known as the scale of nature, Scala Naturae, or the great chain of being. This arrangement ordered all living things hierarchically, from the simplest plant life to the most complex animals, based on their degree of soul and their capacity for vital functions. The concept of soul psyche. Unlike modern usage, Aristotle's soul, psyche, is not a supernatural entity, but the form or actuality of a living body. It is the organizing principle that makes a body alive and capable of specific functions. He defines the soul as the first actuality of a natural body having life potentially. The three kinds of soul. Following the scale of nature, Aristotle identified three distinct types of soul, corresponding to different levels of life. The nutritive soul, found in plants, possessing only the capacity for growth and reproduction. The sensitive soul, found in animals, possessing the nutritive capacity, plus sensation and locomotion. And the rational soul, found only in humans, possessing all capacities, plus reason and intellect. The hierarchy of functions. This hierarchy means that the rational soul of a human being contains the functions of the sensitive and nutritive souls. For instance, a human being can both grow and reproduce, nutritive, and feel and move, sensitive, but only a human can reason. Teleology in biology. Aristotle's biological work is fundamentally teleological. He argued that nature does nothing in vain. Every organ, every structure, and every function of an animal exists for a specific, necessary purpose that contributes to the life and flourishing of the whole organism. The role of final cause. For instance, in his analysis of the hand, he argued that the hand exists for the purpose of grasping, and that purpose is the final cause that explains the hand's structure and development. This teleological perspective became the dominant model for biological explanation until the rise of Darwinism. The method of generation. In Generation of Animals, Aristotle meticulously described the processes of reproduction. He correctly identified the importance of both the male and female contributions, though he mistakenly believed the male contribution, semen, provided the form and the efficient cause, while the female contribution, menstrual fluid, provided only the matter. Pioneering comparative anatomy. Aristotle was the first to practice and document comparative anatomy. He drew insightful comparisons between different species, observing structural similarities and differences in organs, such as the digestive and reproductive systems, to understand their shared lineage and distinct adaptations. The first zoo, Aristotle's immense project, necessitated the collection and keeping of live animals for observation. The Lyceum is sometimes credited with maintaining the first systematic scientific zoo or collection of specimens in history. The problem of spontaneous generation. Although his observations were generally acute, Aristotle accepted the concept of spontaneous generation for some simpler life forms. He believed that certain organisms, like insects or shellfish, could arise directly from non-living matter, like mud or dew under the right conditions, a belief that persisted for centuries. The empirical method of the Lyceum. The Lyceum fostered a collaborative, empirical method. Unlike the solitary contemplation of the academy, Aristotle's school organized students into research teams to collect data, categorize observations, and collaborate on encyclopedic projects, marking the beginning of organized scientific inquiry. The influence on later science. Aristotle's biological and physical treatises provided the bedrock for all subsequent scientific thought. His concepts of elemental composition, natural motion, and teleological function formed the required starting point for figures from the Hellenistic scholars to the medieval natural philosophers. Definition of change, it's physics. In his physics, Aristotle defines change as the actualization of what exists potentially, insofar as it is potential. This highly abstract definition allowed him to categorize all forms of change, qualitative, quantitative, substantial, within his framework of potentiality and actuality. Motion as continuous. Aristotle argued that motion, or change, must be continuous, rejecting the idea that motion could ever occur in discrete jumps, or that space was infinitely divisible into points that could not be traversed. The primacy of sight in his work De Anima, on the soul, Aristotle analyzes the five senses. He elevates sight to the highest of the senses because it provides the most comprehensive, immediate, and clear information about the world, serving as the necessary first step for rational cognition. The link to ethics. The entire study of the natural world, for Aristotle, is ultimately linked to human action. Understanding the inherent form and final cause of human nature, as revealed by science, is the only way to reliably define the goal of human action. Ethics. The natural man, he argues, is the political animal, and his function is rational activity. This necessary link guides our discussion to the practical philosophy of human flourishing. The ethics of flourishing, virtue, habit, and the golden mean. The entire vast framework of Aristotle's metaphysics and physics was built to serve a single ultimate goal, the determination of how human beings ought to live. He believed that understanding the form and final cause of man, as revealed through natural science, was the only reliable path to defining the highest human good. His ethical system is intensely practical, rooted in action, habit, and the cultivation of an inner state of excellence that he termed virtue. It is a philosophy not of abstract ideals, but of practical, rational human flourishing. The goal of action. Aristotle begins his ethical inquiry by asserting that every art, every inquiry, and every human action and choice is reasonably thought to aim at some good. If there are multiple goods that we pursue, there must be a supreme good that all rational human activity ultimately strives for and to which all other goods are subordinate. The supreme good, eudaimonia. Aristotle identifies this supreme good for human beings as eudaimonia, eu meaning good, and daimon meaning spirit or divinity. This term is not simply translated as happiness in the modern sense of a pleasant feeling, but more accurately as flourishing, living well, or human fulfillment. He insists that eudaimonia is the state achieved when a person fully realizes their potential. The rejection of lesser goods. Aristotle explicitly dismisses common misconceptions about the good life. He argues that pleasure, wealth, and honor cannot be the supreme good because pleasure is shared with animals, wealth is merely a means to an end, and honor depends on the opinion of others rather than the state of one's own soul. The function argument. Aristotle uses the function argument to logically define eudaimonia. He reasons that if every specific thing, like a flute player or a statue, has a specific function, then the human being as a whole must also have a specific function that is unique to humanity. Man's unique function. That unique function cannot be mere life, shared with plants, or sensation, shared with animals. The defining function of a human being is rational activity. Therefore, the highest human good, eudaimonia, is rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Virtue as excellence, arete. The Greek word Aristotle uses for virtue is arete, which fundamentally means excellence, or the proper fulfilling of function. For example, the arit of an eye is excellent sight. The arit of a person is excellent character, guided by reason. The two kinds of virtue. Aristotle divides human virtues into two main categories: intellectual virtues, acquired primarily through formal teaching and study, such as theoretical wisdom, Sophia, and practical wisdom, phronesis, and moral virtues, acquired primarily through repetition, practice, and habit, such as courage and temperance. Practical wisdom, phronesis, the most important intellectual virtue for daily ethical life is practical wisdom, phronesis. This is the intellectual capacity that allows a person to rightly deliberate about what is good and beneficial for human beings, enabling them to perceive the correct moral course of action in specific, complex situations. The doctrine of the mean. Aristotle's most famous ethical principle is the doctrine of the mean, or the golden mean. This doctrine states that moral virtue is a mean, a middle state that lies between two corresponding extremes, or vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Courage as the mean. To illustrate, the virtue of courage is the mean that lies between the vice of cowardice, a deficiency of spirit or confidence, and the vice of rashness, an excess of spirit or misplaced confidence. The virtuous act is to hit the mean, temperance as the mean. Similarly, the virtue of temperance is the mean between insensibility, a deficiency of appetite or feeling, and self-indulgence, an excess of appetite. The mean is relative. Aristotle is careful to note that the mean is relative to us, and not an arithmetic mean. The right amount of food for an Olympic athlete is vastly different from the right amount for a sedentary scholar. Virtue requires adjusting the action to the particular person, circumstances, and situation. Virtue as habit, ethos. Aristotle insists that moral virtue is not an innate gift or a single isolated action, but a state of character acquired through habit, ethos. We become just people by repeatedly performing just acts, much like a musician becomes skilled by repeatedly practicing the instrument. No one is born virtuous. This emphasis on habit means that no one is born virtuous or vicious. Our nature gives us the potential for moral character, but that potential must be actualized through continuous, voluntary training and practice. The role of emotion. Aristotle does not ask us to eliminate emotions, as some Stoics would later propose. Instead, the virtuous person is one who has learned to feel emotions like fear, anger, and desire at the right times, toward the right objects, for the right reasons, and in the right manner. This is the core of the mean. The importance of choice, since moral virtue is a state of character concerned with choice. The virtuous act must be done voluntarily and must be chosen for its own sake, because it is noble, not for some external reward or fear of punishment. The nature of friendship, philia. Aristotle dedicated extensive, deep analysis to friendship, philia, in 2 of the 10 books of the Nicomachean Ethics. He viewed it as absolutely essential to eudaimonia, famously writing that no one would choose to live without friends, even if he had all other goods. 3 types of friendship. He categorized friendship into 3 distinct types: friendship of utility, based on mutual benefit and usefulness; friendship of pleasure, based on mutual enjoyment of shared activities or wit; and the friendship of virtue, based on a shared mutual commitment to moral excellence, which he considered the highest, most stable, and most enduring form. Self-love and virtue. Aristotle argues for a specific form of rational self-love. The virtuous person is rightly a lover of self, not in the sense of selfish indulgence, but in the sense that he chooses the noble, virtuous action over base pleasure, thereby securing the best and most rational part of his own soul. Contemplation as the highest good. While recognizing the necessity of moral virtue for daily political life, Aristotle concludes that the highest and most godlike human activity is contemplation, theoria, the pure intellectual exercise of reason and philosophical thought. This is the ultimate realization of the rational function, contemplation's self-sufficiency. He argues that contemplation is the highest good because it is the most self-sufficient activity, requiring little external means or partners, the most continuous, and the activity that most perfectly imitates the unchanging activity of the unmoved mover. The practicality of ethics. Unlike Plato's reliance on knowing the transcendent forms to act morally, Aristotle's ethics are intensely practical and contextual. The virtuous person is the one who, through experience and phronesis, can rightly perceive the morally appropriate mean, the necessary course of action, and the immediate, complex reality of the situation. The inseparability of ethics and politics. The entire pursuit of eudaimonia leads directly from the individual soul to the community. For Aristotle, the ethical life is ultimately inseparable from the political life. The proper setting for human flourishing is the state, polis, as the good of the community is greater than and includes the good of the individual. This logical progression leads us directly into his monumental study of the ideal society and the nature of man as the political animal. The political animal, the structure of society and constitutional law, the ultimate conclusion of Aristotle's ethical system is that the fully realized, flourishing life, the state of eudaimonia, can only be achieved within the structured environment of a political community. For Aristotle, the individual is inherently incomplete outside of the city-state, or polis. He viewed the study of politics as the highest science, the master science, because it governs all other arts and determines the essential conditions under which human virtue can be perfected. His political project was deeply empirical, a systematic comparative analysis of real governments aimed at finding not the ideal utopia, but the best practical state. The master science. Aristotle explicitly names politics as the master science, architectonic, meaning the supreme or governing science. This is because politics determines the environment in which all other arts, sciences, and ethics, the pursuit of the individual good, must operate. It dictates which activities are allowed and to what end, ensuring that the community's overall goal, the collective good, is pursued. Man as the political animal, Aristotle's most famous and consequential political dictum, is that man is by nature a political animal, zoon politikon. This means that human beings are fundamentally social and political creatures whose natural end, or telos, rational activity, can only be fully actualized by living together in a communal state, polis. Anyone living outside the polis, he asserts, is either a beast or a god. The natural origin of the state is not an artificial or conventional construct. It is a natural culmination of smaller units. The household naturally forms the village, and the village naturally evolves into the self-sufficient state, polis. The state possessing the full means to achieve self-sufficiency is thus the highest and final form of human community existing by nature. The state's purpose. The state comes into being, Aristotle argues, for the sake of survival, but its true and highest purpose is to continue to exist for the sake of living well, i.e., achieving widespread eudaimonia. The political community's highest goal is to facilitate and encourage the life of virtue and flourishing for its citizens. The authority of the law against Plato, who championed the absolute, unconstrained rule of the philosopher king, Aristotle argued that the true sovereign authority in the state should be the law, not an individual. The law, he famously declared, is reason without passion, and is therefore a more objective, stable, and just standard than the shifting will or transient opinions of any single ruler. The empirical study of constitutions. In a monumental empirical project, Aristotle and his students at the Lyceum collected and rigorously analyzed the actual constitutions of 158 Greek city-states. This vast, detailed comparative study established the foundation for the Western tradition of comparative constitutional law and political science. The Constitution of the Athenians. Of the 158 constitutional studies compiled by the Lyceum, only one complete text survives today: the Constitution of the Athenians, Athenian Politeia. The text details the history of Athenian democracy, including its various stages, institutions, and legal structures, providing an invaluable resource for historians. The 6 forms of government. Based on this empirical evidence, Aristotle classified all constitutions according to 2 essential criteria. First, the number of rulers, one, few, or many, and second, whether they rule in their own private interest or for the common good, the virtuous goal. This yielded 3 correct forms and 3 corrupt deviations. The 3 correct forms. The 3 good or correct forms of government, where rulers govern in the common interest, are monarchy, ruled by one virtuous individual; aristocracy, ruled by the virtuous few; and politeia, ruled by the many, a constitutional government. The 3 corrupt forms. The 3 bad or corrupt forms of government, where rulers govern in their own selfish interest, are tyranny, the corruption of monarchy, ruling for self-interest; oligarchy, the corruption of aristocracy, ruled by the wealthy few for self-interest; and democracy, the corruption of politeia, ruled by the poor many for their own class interest. The distinction between democracy and politeia. It is vital to note that Aristotle's use of the term democracy is often negative. He defines it as the corrupt rule of the poor majority solely in their own interest, often at the expense of property rights. His preferred politeia is a true constitutional republic, where the many rule according to the law and with regard for the common good. The best practical state, politeia. Aristotle concluded that the absolute ideal state is a pure theoretical aristocracy, ruled by the truly best and most virtuous, but the best practical and achievable form for most states is the politeia, constitutional republic. This is a mixed constitution that blends and thus moderates the excesses of oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy, and democracy, ruled by the poor. The importance of the middle class. A defining characteristic of the stable politeia is the dominance of the middle class. Aristotle argued that the citizens of the middle class are the most stable element of society because they are neither excessively rich, which leads to arrogance and crime, nor excessively poor, which leads to desperation and revolution. They are the most inclined toward reason, moderation, and adherence to law. The nature of the citizen. For Aristotle, the citizen is not merely a resident. The citizen is a free, adult male who actively participates in the deliberative, legislative, and judicial functions of the state. He must have the leisure time and intellectual capacity, virtue, necessary to both govern and be governed in turn. The exclusion of the laborer. Due to his definition, Aristotle explicitly excluded laborers, merchants, women, and slaves from full citizenship. He argued that manual labor and a trade prevented the necessary leisure required for rational participation in political life. Views on slavery. Aristotle accepted the controversial standard practice of slavery, arguing that some individuals were slaves by nature, lacking the capacity for full rational deliberation, and thus best suited to be the living instruments of others who possess reason. He saw this as necessary for the virtuous citizens to gain the leisure required for politics. The principle of distributive justice. In his discussion of justice, Aristotle introduced the concept of distributive justice. This principle holds that goods, honors, and offices should be distributed among citizens not equally, but proportionately to their relative contributions to the state or their merit, their political virtue. The art of rhetoric. In his treatise Rhetoric, Aristotle systematically codified the art of effective persuasion. He viewed rhetoric not as mere trickery, but as a neutral and necessary tool, a practical counterpart to logic, used to discern probable truths and achieve conviction in the political assembly and the law courts. The three modes of persuasion. Aristotle defined the three essential, universal modes of persuasion that all effective speakers must employ to move an audience: ethos, the speaker's character, credibility, and authority; pathos, appealing to the audience's emotion; and logos, the logical argument itself. Rhetoric and dialectic. He strongly linked rhetoric to dialectic, philosophical discussion, and the argument. He argued that rhetoric is essentially the ability to see what is possibly persuasive in every situation, much like dialectic is the ability to argue on any subject. The Poetics and the Defense of Art. Aristotle wrote the Poetics primarily to analyze the nature of poetic art, especially tragedy. This work stands as a direct rational defense of art against the radical critique lodged by his teacher, Plato, in the Republic. The definition of tragedy. He defines tragedy as the imitation of a serious, complete action that possesses magnitude. This imitation is performed by actors, not narrated, and aims to arouse the emotions of pity and fear in the audience. Catharsis. Aristotle introduced the critical, enduring concept of catharsis. This is the goal of tragedy, the purification or purging of the emotions of pity and fear. By experiencing these powerful emotions safely through art, the audience achieves a necessary psychological and emotional release, validating the art form. The tragic flaw, hamartia. The ideal tragic hero for Aristotle is a person of high standing who falls into misfortune not because of pure evil, but because of some single identifiable error in judgment or character flaw, hamartia, making their downfall both inevitable and deeply moving. The unities of tragedy. Aristotle identified specific structural elements for effective tragedy, later formalized as the three unities, though he explicitly stressed only the unity of action. Action, a single, continuous plotline. Time, the action takes place within a short period, ideally 24 hours. And place, the action occurs in a single location. The importance of plot. In Poetics, Aristotle argues that the plot, mythos, is the soul of tragedy. He believed that a well-structured, coherent plot, where events follow a necessary or probable sequence, is more important than the character development, stagecraft, or spectacle. The enduring influence on Western law. Aristotle's concepts of the rule of law and his distinction between distributive justice, fair allocation of goods, and corrective justice, rectifying wrongs between individuals, formed the bedrock for the development of Western legal theory and jurisprudence. The unity of philosophy. The final conclusion of Aristotle's comprehensive system is that all his fields of study, logic, metaphysics, physics, ethics, and politics, are unified. They all seek to understand the form and final cause of their respective subjects, culminating in the master science of politics, which creates the optimal environment for the most rational human life. The practical success of his entire philosophical method would next be tested by the tumultuous political events that would bring his own life to a close. Exile, the lost library, and the birth of Hellenistic philosophy. The life of Aristotle, the supreme rationalist who demanded that life be governed by reason and the rule of law, ultimately met a fate determined by the unpredictable chaos of political passion and violence. His close ties to the now dominant Macedonian Empire, which had protected his school for over a decade, became his greatest liability. The last years of his life, though spent in exile, were crucial for the fate of his entire intellectual legacy, a massive collection of works that almost vanished from history altogether. The unforeseen event. The relative stability that allowed the Lyceum to flourish in Athens was violently shattered by a single, seismic political event in 323 BC, the sudden and unexpected death of Alexander the Great in Babylon at the age of 32. This event instantly destabilized the vast Macedonian Empire and triggered a fierce, widespread surge of anti-Macedonian sentiment throughout the Greek city-states, especially in Athens. Political vulnerability. Aristotle, being a close confidant and former tutor to Alexander, and a long-time resident under Macedonian protection, immediately became a figure of intense political scrutiny and hatred. The city's democratic faction, which was aggressively regaining power, sought to purge all those associated with the former regime. The charge of impiety. Following the resurgence of democracy, Aristotle was formally charged with a sabaia, or impiety, irreligion. This was the very charge that had led to the execution of his mentor, Socrates, decades earlier. The specific accusation was related to a highly complimentary hymn he had composed in honor of his deceased father-in-law, Hermias, which was interpreted by his accusers as sacrilegious deification. The avoidance of trial. Mindful of the fate of Socrates and recognizing the volatile political environment, Aristotle chose not to stand trial. He famously declared that he would not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy, indicating his refusal to give the volatile mob the satisfaction of executing another great thinker. The flight from Athens. Aristotle immediately fled Athens with his family and close associates. He found refuge on a family estate in Chalcis, on the island of Euboea, the same region from which his family had originally hailed. This marked the end of his permanent residence in Athens and the suspension of the Lyceum's primary activities. The death in exile. Aristotle died peacefully in exile in Chalcis in 322 BC, just a year after fleeing Athens at the age of 62. His death was reportedly due to a stomach illness, ending the life of the philosopher not through violence, but through natural causes, yet far from the city that owed him its greatest intellectual debt, the successor of the Lyceum. Before his death, Aristotle carefully designated his chief colleague, Theophrastus of Eresus, to succeed him as the head scholarch of the Bede's peripatetic school. Theophrastus was a brilliant botanist and philosopher who ably led the school for decades, maintaining Aristotle's empirical traditions. The fate of the manuscripts. The preservation of Aristotle's legacy is one of the most astonishing stories in intellectual history. His vast collection of esoteric, technical manuscripts and library, the very lecture notes that form his surviving works, were not immediately published or widely circulated. The hidden scrolls. The manuscripts were passed down through the hands of Theophrastus and then to his successor, Neleus of Skepsis. Neleus's family, fearing that the scrolls would be confiscated by the book-collecting kings of Pergamum, hid the irreplaceable documents in a damp cellar or vault for approximately 200 years. The damage and rediscovery. During those 2 centuries of concealment, the scrolls suffered significant damage from moisture, worms, and neglect. The surviving manuscripts were only rediscovered around the 1st century BC and eventually sold to a wealthy book collector named Apellicon of Teos. The Roman intervention. The scrolls eventually made their way to Rome around 86 BC after the city was sacked by the Roman general Sulla. This accidental acquisition placed the long-hidden technical works of Aristotle into the hands of Roman scholars and eventually the broader intellectual world. The work of Andronicus, the disorganized, damaged, and highly technical lecture notes, finally gained structure thanks to the efforts of Andronicus of Rhodes in the 1st century BC. Andronicus undertook the monumental task of editing, compiling, and formally arranging the treatises, giving them the sequence and names, like metaphysics, that we use today. The lost exoteric works. It is crucial to remember that the works we possess are the technical esoteric treatises intended for advanced students. Aristotle's exoteric works, the polished, eloquent dialogues, and popular writings intended for the general public, similar to Plato's dialogues, were largely lost to history. The immediate Hellenistic impact. Despite the temporary disappearance of his technical works, Aristotle's general philosophy and empirical methods profoundly influenced the subsequent Hellenistic period. Theophrastus's botanical work and the ethical focus on individual tranquility and self-sufficiency, as seen in Stoicism and Epicureanism, are direct intellectual descendants of the Lyceum. Influence on Stoicism. The early Stoics, particularly their emphasis on logic as the first branch of philosophy, their belief that virtue is the only true good, and their ethical focus on living in agreement with nature, draw heavily on Aristotle's systematic approach and his concept of virtue as the fulfillment of man's natural function. Influence on Epicureanism. Even the rival school of Epicureanism, which championed pleasure, hedon, as the highest good, operated within an Aristotelian framework. Epicurus needed to formally refute Aristotle's teleology and cosmology before he could establish his own atomic theory and ethical system. The Roman appropriation. While Roman intellectual life initially favored the ethical clarity of Stoicism and the literary beauty of Plato, Aristotle's systematic approach became essential for their legal and administrative structures. His distinction between different forms of justice, distributive and corrective, directly influenced Roman jurisprudence and legal classification. Aristotle's will. The surviving records of Aristotle's last will and testament reveal his organized and humane character. He provided carefully for his daughter, Pythias, and his son, Nicomachus, and ensured his partner, Herpillus, was well taken care of. He even stipulated that several of his loyal, long-serving slaves be freed upon his death. The legacy of the Lyceum. Although the leadership changed, the Lyceum continued to operate as a major center of learning for centuries, specializing in natural sciences and history, maintaining Aristotle's empirical tradition long after the academy had evolved into a more skeptical and then a Neoplatonic school. The principle of oikonomia. In his Politics, Aristotle discusses the concept of oikonomia, which gives us the modern word economics, defining it as the proper management of the household, oikos. He sharply contrasted this necessary and virtuous pursuit with crematistics, which he defined as the unnatural pursuit of wealth for its own sake, especially through usury or excessive trade. The definition of money. Aristotle was the first major thinker to formally define money. He argued that money is a social convention, not a natural good. Its essential function is threefold: as a medium of exchange, a measure of value, and a store of value. This formulation remains the standard definition in monetary theory. The systematization of biology, revisited. His biological classifications, including his distinctions between animals with blood, vertebrates, and those without, invertebrates, which he called Enaima and Anaima, formed the basis of zoology until the 16th century. His work was characterized by a systematic spirit that cataloged all known data before theorizing. The enduring influence of the four causes. Even after his specific physical theories, like geocentrism, were overturned, the framework of the four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, persisted as the standard method for comprehensive explanation in philosophy and science until the modern era, forcing thinkers to consider a phenomenon from every explanatory angle. The birth of literary criticism. Aristotle's Poetics, though a slim work, inaugurated the entire field of literary criticism. His analysis of the necessary components of plot, character, and dramatic structure provided the first enduring vocabulary for evaluating the quality and effect of narrative art. The final farewell to Athens. Aristotle's final choice to prioritize his life and his intellectual legacy over a political spectacle contrasts sharply with Socrates' dramatic martyrdom. By choosing to flee, he ensured that his work survived the immediate political turmoil, allowing his extraordinary synthesis of knowledge to eventually shape the world that his student Alexander had connected. His influence was simply waiting for the world to rediscover his hidden knowledge. The global afterlife, medieval synthesis, Renaissance rediscovery, and the enduring foundation. The centuries following Aristotle's death and the temporary loss of his greatest technical works did not diminish his stature, they merely postponed his ultimate reign. When his comprehensive treatises were finally rediscovered, they did not simply join the intellectual debate, they commandeered it. For 1,000 years, Aristotle became the philosopher, his system the framework of reality, and his method the very definition of rational inquiry. His legacy is found everywhere, from the theological structures of the Middle Ages to the empirical methods of modern science. The Great Rediscovery, the rediscovery and compilation of Aristotle's technical works by Andronicus of Rhodes in the 1st century BC, was a pivotal moment. It introduced a rigorous, systematic methodology to the previously more fluid Roman intellectual scene, setting the stage for his global dominance. The commentators of antiquity. The late Hellenistic and Roman periods saw the rise of numerous influential commentators who devoted their careers to interpreting and teaching Aristotle's dense, technical texts. Figures like Alexander of Aphrodisias, the exegete, played a crucial role in clarifying his subtle arguments on the soul and metaphysics. The rise of scholasticism. The most decisive moment for Aristotle's Western legacy occurred in the High Middle Ages. His systematic logic and rational analysis became the essential methodology of scholasticism, the dominant philosophical movement in the European universities. Scholastic thinkers used his method to reconcile reason and religious faith. The Arab preservation. While the West was still fragmented, scholars in the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 13th centuries, preserved, translated, and profoundly engaged with Aristotle's complete corpus. His works, particularly the Organon, were foundational to Islamic philosophy, falsafa. The Muslim masters, figures like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and most famously Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, not only preserved Aristotle, but integrated his metaphysics into an Islamic theological framework. Averroes was so dedicated that he was simply known in the West as the commentator. The Jewish synthesis. Simultaneously, major Jewish philosophers, such as Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, synthesized Aristotle's teleological and ethical philosophy with Jewish thought. Maimonides' work, The Guide for the Perplexed, reconciled Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover with the transcendent God of Abraham. The return to the West. Aristotle's works were reintroduced to Western Europe, primarily during the 12th and 13th centuries, through Latin translations made from the Arabic texts preserved in Spain. This influx of systematic, complex Greek thought created an intellectual revolution in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. The Christian synthesis, Aquinas, the most significant synthesis of Aristotle and Christian doctrine, was achieved by St. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. In his Summa Theologiae, Aquinas adopted Aristotle's entire logical, ethical, and metaphysical system, including the four causes and the distinction between form and matter, to provide a rational foundation for Catholic theology. Aristotle as the philosopher. Due to the depth and comprehensiveness of his thought and the widespread reliance on his system, medieval thinkers universally referred to Aristotle simply as the philosopher, a testament to his unmatched intellectual authority across three major civilizations. The Aristotelian University. Until the scientific revolution, the academic curriculum of virtually every European university was fundamentally Aristotelian. Students were required to master the Organon, logic, and his physics before moving on to metaphysics and ethics, structuring the entire liberal arts education. The birth of formal science. Aristotle's most profound and lasting contribution to the modern world is that he invented the very idea of a formal science with defined terms, axioms, rules of inference, and subject matter. His systematic approach is the blueprint for all scientific disciplines. The role of induction and deduction. Modern scientific method is a complex dance between induction, gathering data to form hypotheses, and deduction, testing those hypotheses with logic. Aristotle was the first to formalize both processes as essential parts of the philosophical and scientific inquiry. The critique of geocentrism. The rise of figures like Copernicus and Galileo did not initially dismiss Aristotle. Rather, they used his rigorous methods to prove that his cosmological conclusions, geocentrism, were wrong. Their victory was a triumph of Aristotelian method, empirical observation, and mathematical necessity over Aristotelian authority. The enduring influence of teleology. While modern biology often avoids assigning explicit purpose to nature, Aristotle's concept of teleology, the study of ends, goals, and functions, remains essential in engineering, medicine, and management, where actions are always designed to achieve an intended outcome or final cause. Influence on economic thought. Aristotle's distinction between oikonomia, proper household management for use value, and crematistics, unnatural wealth gathering for exchange value, provided the foundational ethical critique of pure profit-seeking that influenced philosophers and economists, including Adam Smith and Karl Marx. The revival of empiricism. The modern philosophical movement of empiricism, as seen in Locke and Hume, which insists that all knowledge is derived from sensory experience, is a direct intellectual descendant of Aristotle's fundamental commitment to the observable world. Influence on legal theory. Aristotle's concepts of distributive justice, proportional merit-based fairness, and corrective justice, rectification of wrongs, form the basic analytical structure of jurisprudence in virtually every Western legal code. Aristotle and literary theory. His poetics established the vocabulary of literary criticism that was strictly applied during the Renaissance and neoclassical eras, giving rise to rigid rules for tragedy and drama, such as the strict adherence to the three unities. The concept of the mean, revisited. The golden mean remains a powerful, accessible, and universally applied concept in ethical reasoning, counseling, and political moderation, long surviving the demise of his physical theories. It provides a timeless guide for balanced action. The peripatetic legacy. Even after the Lyceum was destroyed by Sulla, the peripatetic tradition of empirical research and compilation of knowledge continued, influencing institutions like the Library of Alexandria and contributing to the development of systematic history and geography. The nature of form, revisited. While Plato's forms were separated, Aristotle's immanent form, the structure within the matter, became a crucial concept in later debates on identity, essence, and individual nature, central to understanding things like biological taxonomy and human character. The enduring language of logic. Regardless of which logical system one uses, the core vocabulary of Western thought is Aristotelian. Substance, accident, predicate, genus, species, definition, and proposition are all terms solidified or invented by the philosopher. The importance of phronesis, practical wisdom. In modern ethical theory, there is a strong movement to revive Aristotle's focus on phronesis, or practical wisdom, arguing that moral action requires more than abstract rule following. It requires experienced judgment and situational awareness. The final judgment, Dante. The immense universal respect for Aristotle is perhaps best symbolized by his placement in Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Dante places him not in the circles of the damned, but in the virtuous circle of limbo, describing him reverently as the master of those who know. The unending synthesis. The philosophical journey of the West is not a linear path, but a continuous synthesis between the two poles established by Plato and Aristotle, the idealist soaring toward the heavens and the empiricist grounded in observation. Every major school of thought, from rationalism to existentialism, has sought to balance the eternal truth, Plato, with the concrete experience, Aristotle, confirming his eternal role as the necessary foundation of all subsequent rational inquiry. The great challenge, from medieval authority to modern science. The intellectual dominance of Aristotle's thought was so complete during the Middle Ages that his system became synonymous with rationality itself. His comprehensive framework defined the boundaries of knowledge, providing satisfying explanations for everything from the fall of an apple to the motion of the stars. Yet the very authority he wielded eventually led to the challenges that defined the beginning of the modern era. The history of science after the 16th century is, in many ways, the story of systematically overturning Aristotelian physics while simultaneously retaining Aristotelian method. The crisis of the condemnations in 1277. While the Christian synthesis of Aristotle, achieved by Thomas Aquinas, was largely successful, the full influx of his non-theological works, particularly those concerning the eternity of the world, Fact 56, and the limited causality of the unmoved mover, Fact 54, caused profound alarm in the Parisian theological faculties. The Parisian condemnations. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tampier, issued a major condemnation of 219 propositions derived from Averroistic Aristotelianism and natural philosophy. This event was a deliberate attempt to assert the absolute power of God's will and challenge the idea that certain effects were naturally necessary, thereby limiting the scope of pure Aristotelian reason within the university. The first cracks in physics. Even within the late medieval universities, thinkers began to critically challenge Aristotle's physics. The Parisian impetus theory, developed by scholars like Jean Buridan in the 14th century, proposed that a moving object retains an internal impetus that sustains its motion, challenging Aristotle's view that a continuous external mover was required for all non-natural motion. This was a crucial precursor to the concept of inertia. The overthrow of geocentrism. The greatest and most famous challenge came with the scientific revolution. The astronomical observations and mathematical models of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo systematically dismantled the Aristotelian Ptolemaic geocentric model, Fact 61, of the universe. This shift, placing the sun at the center, heliocentrism, fundamentally broke the distinction between the perfect celestial realm, ether, and the corruptible sublunary realm, Fact 60. The challenge to motion, Galileo Galilei, was particularly effective in refuting Aristotle's dynamics. Aristotle had argued that heavier objects fall faster because they have a greater tendency to seek their natural place, Fact 59. Galileo's famous experiments, whether real or thought experiments, demonstrated that barring air resistance, objects of different weights fall at the same rate, fundamentally destroying the theory of natural place. The role of telescopic observation. The use of the telescope by Galileo revealed imperfections on the moon, craters and mountains, and demonstrated that Jupiter had moons orbiting it. These discoveries contradicted the Aristotelian doctrine that the celestial bodies were perfect, unblemished spheres composed of the immutable ether, Fact 60. The new cosmology. With the advent of Newtonian physics In the 17th century, the entire Aristotelian system was replaced by a unified mechanics that applied equally to the heavens and the earth. Newton's universal gravitation explained the motion of the planets, replacing the final cause of the unmoved mover, fact 54, with the efficient cause of physical force. The rejection of teleology in physics. The new physics rejected the use of final causes, purpose, in explaining physical motion, focusing instead solely on material and efficient causes, force and composition. This meant that the question, why does an apple fall, was answered by the force of gravity, not by the apple seeking its telos at the center of the earth. The enduring influence on biology. Despite its complete failure in physics, Aristotle's methodology and emphasis on teleology remained powerful in biology for much longer. Naturalists still used his framework to classify species and describe the purpose of organs until the theory of evolution by natural selection offered an alternative, non-teleological explanation for biological structure and function. The modern revival of virtue ethics. In the mid-20th century, a significant movement arose in moral philosophy to challenge the dominance of abstract, rule-based ethics like Kantianism and consequence-based ethics like utilitarianism. This movement, known as virtue ethics, is a direct and conscious revival of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, fact 81, focus on character. Modern virtue ethics, championed by philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, re-emphasizes Aristotle's core ideas, that morality is about developing a virtuous character, ethos, through habit, fact 93, and that ethical judgment requires practical wisdom, phronesis, fact 88, rather than the application of universal, rigid moral laws. Influence on constitutionalism. Aristotle's empirical study of 158 constitutions, fact 113, and his conclusion that the mixed constitution, politeia, fact 119, is the most stable form of government, was profoundly influential on Enlightenment and early American political thinkers. The American founding. Figures like James Madison, a key architect of the U.S. Constitution, consciously adopted Aristotle's principles of political stability. The U.S. system of checks and balances and the separation of powers can be seen as a modern attempt to create an Aristotelian mixed constitution that blends monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. Natural law theory. Aristotle's definition of the state as a natural institution, fact 110, that exists for the sake of living well established, the foundation for the entire tradition of natural law. This theory posits that certain rights and moral values are inherent in human nature and can be discovered by reason, forming a universal ethical basis for all positive law. The concept of the mean in conflict resolution. Beyond academic ethics, the practical application of the golden mean, fact 89, has found lasting life in fields like psychology, counseling, and diplomacy, where finding a rational, temperate course of action between destructive extremes is the goal of conflict resolution. The distinction between theory and practice. Aristotle's sharp distinction between theoretical sciences, metaphysics, physics, mathematics, and practical sciences, ethics, politics, remains fundamental to the organization of academic disciplines today, where pure research is separated from applied or policy-focused studies. The principle of hylomorphism, the metaphysical doctrine of hylomorphism, the composite of form and matter, fact 44, proved incredibly resilient. It was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church to explain the concept of transubstantiation, where the form of the bread and wine changes at consecration, while the matter remains the same, thereby ensuring hylomorphism's continued theological relevance for centuries. The logic of probability. While Aristotle's primary focus was on deductive certainty, the syllogism, his work on rhetoric, Fact 125, and dialectic, Fact 127, was crucial for developing the logic of probability and plausible reasoning, which is essential for ethical, political, and daily decision-making, where absolute truth is often inaccessible. His influence on modern linguistics. Aristotle's analysis of the fundamental components of language, his distinctions between nouns, verbs, propositions, and terms, laid the groundwork for the entire field of formal linguistics and the philosophy of language. The unresolved question of the active intellect, one of the most fiercely debated points in the history of philosophy, is Aristotle's brief and cryptic discussion of the active intellect in De Anima, on the soul. This part of the soul is described as immortal and separable, leading to centuries of interpretive conflict among Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholars about whether the intellect was individual or universal. The founding of zoology. Long before Linnaeus, Aristotle's methodology of classifying organisms based on shared characteristics and reproductive methods, Fact 157, established the framework for zoological taxonomy. His detailed biological observations were a scientific achievement that remained unparalleled for nearly 2,000 years. The enduring poetics. Despite being unfinished, Aristotle's Poetics has been instrumental in shaping modern film and narrative theory. Concepts like the tragic flaw, hamartia, Fact 131, and plot structure, Fact 133, are still used in creative writing and script analysis to gauge the efficacy of a story. The Lyceum's final closure. The Lyceum, the philosophical school Aristotle founded, eventually faded in influence. It was finally closed, along with the other Athenian philosophical schools, by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II 29 AD, marking the symbolic end of the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. The power of taxonomy. Aristotle's legacy is, ultimately, the triumph of taxonomy, the classification of knowledge. He transformed philosophy from a poetic quest for the good, Socrates, Plato, into a systematic encyclopedic mapping of reality, creating the intellectual landscape we still inhabit. The eternal dialogue. The story of Aristotle is the story of the rational mind-seeking order in a chaotic world. Even as we use modern science to correct his physics and perfect his method, we cannot escape his foundational questions. Whether we are classifying a new species, drafting a constitution, or choosing a virtuous course of action, we are invariably answering a question first formulated by the master of those who know. This synthesis of the rational and the observable remains his most profound, final teaching. The fundamental divide, Aristotle versus Plato, and the deep structure of the soul. The vast systematic structure of Aristotle's philosophy stands as the definitive counterpoint to the towering idealism of his teacher, Plato. The ultimate intellectual drama of ancient Greece is the conflict between these two men, the idealist who sought truth above and beyond the senses, and the empiricist who insisted that reality and knowledge must be found within the sensible world. This fundamental divide, what we might call the Platonic problem, is the central argument that defines Aristotle's specific contributions to metaphysics, logic, and the understanding of the human soul. The Platonic problem, the core disagreement between the two philosophers, is known as the problem of universals. This fundamental question asks, do universal properties, like justice, redness, or manhood, exist independently of the particular things that exhibit them? This is the dividing line that separates the two great systems of Western thought. Plato's transcendent realism. Plato held a view known as transcendent realism. He argued that the universal is a separate eternal form, eidos, existing in a non-physical realm, accessed only by the intellect. Particular objects are merely imperfect, temporal copies of the perfect form. Aristotle's immanent realism. Aristotle held a view known as immanent realism, or moderate realism. He countered that the universal exists only in the particulars. The essence of man, the form, is inseparable from the actual, concrete, primary substance of this man, Socrates. There is no separate, transcendent world of forms, the priority of the particular. For Aristotle, primary substance, the individual, concrete thing, is the most real thing that exists. Universals, secondary substance, are merely abstractions formed by the mind after observing many individual, similar things. This philosophical move cemented the supremacy of the observable, empirical world in his system. The shift in philosophical focus. This divergence fundamentally changed the course of philosophy. Plato's system encouraged contemplation of abstract, mathematical ideals. Aristotle's system redirected inquiry towards systematic, empirical research of the physical world, laying the ground for natural science. The composition of the soul. In his major work, De Anima, On the Soul, Aristotle delves into the structure of the rational soul, arguing that its components correspond to the different degrees of rational activity. The scientific part, concerned with necessary, eternal truths, and the calculative part, concerned with contingent, changing truths, such as practical ethics. The ultimate good and contemplation. Aristotle's final, highest definition of eudaimonia, human flourishing, is reserved for contemplation, theoria. He argues that because the contemplative life is the fullest and most perfect realization of man's unique, godlike capacity for reason, it is the ultimate fulfillment of the human telos, the contemplative life. He describes the contemplative life as the most self-sufficient, the most pleasurable, because intellectual pleasure is pure and constant, and the most akin to the activity of the unmoved mover. While the moral life is absolutely necessary for the polis, the purely contemplative life is superior, the necessity of external goods. However, Aristotle remains the pragmatist. He concedes that even the sublime contemplative life requires external goods, such as health, sufficient food, some wealth, and friends, to sustain the body and provide the necessary leisure for thought. Flourishing is thus a holistic state, not an ascetic one. Virtue and rational desire. Aristotle redefined the relationship between reason and desire. Virtue is not achieved by annihilating desire, but by harmonizing desire with reason. The virtuous person is the one whose feelings and desires naturally align with what their practical reason, phronesis, dictates as the golden mean. The nature of pleasure. Against those who condemned pleasure entirely, Aristotle argued that pleasure is the completion or perfection of an activity. Good activity, virtuous action, yields true, corresponding pleasure, while bad activity yields false, incomplete pleasure. Pleasure is therefore a necessary sign of a life well lived. The logic of contingency, modal logic. Beyond the syllogism of necessary inference, Aristotle pioneered modal logic, the study of arguments concerning necessity, possibility, and contingency. This framework allowed him to analyze statements that are not always true, but could be true under specific conditions. The sea battle argument. A famous example in his modal logic is the sea battle argument, which explores the thorny problem of future contingents. He asks whether the proposition, "there will be a sea battle tomorrow," is true or false now. His complex analysis involves distinguishing between logical certainty and the open nature of actual future events. The doctrine of homonymy. Aristotle clarified the crucial logical concept of homonymy, or the way that words can have multiple, distinct meanings. He insisted that proper philosophical and scientific inquiry requires defining terms precisely and resolving homonymy, or else confusion and contradiction are inevitable. The importance of Topica, his work. Topica focuses on dialectic, the art of finding arguments for any given proposition from generally accepted premises. While logic deals with certainty, dialectic is the necessary method of persuasion and philosophical debate when certainty cannot be reached, such as in law or politics. The four types of opposites. In his logical treatises, Aristotle systematically categorized the ways things can be opposed: correlatives, like father and son; contraries, like good and bad; privatives, like sight and blindness; and contradictories, like is sitting and is not sitting. This analysis brought fundamental precision to the study of language and thought. The relationship to mathematics. Unlike Plato, who viewed mathematics as the purest form of knowledge, Aristotle viewed mathematics as a theoretical science that abstracts its subjects from sensible particulars. It is essential, but is subordinate to metaphysics, first philosophy, because it does not study being as being in its ultimate form. The development of scientific method. Aristotle established the two-step process of scientific inquiry. First, induction from sense data to establish general principles, and second, deduction, syllogism, from those principles to explain specific phenomena. This model of explanation formed the foundation of Western science until the early modern era. The concept of the nous poietikos, active intellect. His brief and cryptic reference to the active intellect states that it is a part of the soul that is separable, impassive, and unmixed, being in essence an actuality. This passage generated centuries of theological debate, with the most famous interpretation by Averroes suggesting the intellect was a single, universal force shared by all humanity. The unfinished corpus. Despite its vastness, Aristotle's surviving corpus is incomplete and often appears disjointed, reflecting its origin as lecture notes and treatises rather than polished literary works. Scholars believe that the order and arrangement of certain books, like those within the metaphysics, were likely compiled by later editors, such as Andronicus. The influence on Renaissance humanism. While the Renaissance initially focused on Platonic idealism, the humanist movement eventually reclaimed Aristotle's emphasis on rhetoric, political science, and practical ethics. Humanists valued his grounded, civic-minded philosophy over the scholastic obsession with abstract logic. The legacy of the final cause in nature. Even after the rejection of his physical teleology, the concept of the final cause, purpose, remains necessary for disciplines like psychology and sociology. When analyzing human behavior, one must always ask, what is the goal or telos of this action? a question fundamentally Aristotelian. The importance of de anima. Aristotle's De Anima is considered the first systematic treatise on psychology. His method of analyzing mental phenomena by reference to biological function, sensation, and physical cause and effect remained the dominant approach to understanding mind and soul for centuries. The unity of virtue revisited. Aristotle held that true moral virtue requires practical wisdom, phronesis, and since phronesis is a single unified capacity of mind, a person cannot truly possess one moral virtue, e.g., courage, without also possessing the others, as true virtue is the ability to hit the mean in all areas of life. The eternal counterbalance. The story of Aristotle concludes with the understanding that he provides the essential counterbalance to all pure idealism. He reminds us that the quest for truth must always be grounded in the observable reality, that perfection is found in the full actuality of the here and now, and that the noblest life is one of rational, practiced, and moderate action. This balance between the ideal and the actual ensures that the dialogue between Plato and Aristotle, the two great minds of the ancient world, will continue for as long as humans seek to both understand and improve their existence. The culmination of this entire philosophical project, the systematization of all reality, is what truly defines the master of those who know. The final synthesis, of course, the architect of Western thought. The story of Aristotle is not just the account of a single brilliant life. It is the Genesis narrative of the entire intellectual tradition that followed. His systematic approach provided the vocabulary, the method, and the architectural plan for philosophy, science, and ethics. To fully grasp his stature, we must conclude by acknowledging the residual genius found in his specific, final contributions that underpinned the foundations of numerous specialized fields. He was the great universalist, and his mind, unlike any before or since, defined the boundaries of human knowledge itself. The founding of meteorology. Aristotle wrote the first comprehensive treatise on the subject, entitled Meteorologica. This work was a systematic attempt to explain all phenomena occurring between the Earth and the Moon, including weather events like rain, clouds, wind, and thunder, and even geological events like earthquakes and comets. The element of water. In Meteorologica, Aristotle's analysis of water was crucial. He defined water as the primary element in the hydrological cycle, existing in the atmosphere in its gaseous form, vapor, and returning to Earth as its liquid form, rain, providing the first rational, detailed explanation of the water cycle. The Earth as a sphere. Although his cosmology was geocentric, Aristotle was one of the earliest philosophers to provide empirical arguments for the spherical shape of the Earth. He cited two main pieces of evidence: the curved shadow the Earth casts on the Moon during a lunar eclipse, and the change in visible constellations as one travels north or south. The logic of demonstration. In the posterior analytics, Aristotle formalized the necessary conditions for scientific demonstration. He insisted that true knowledge must proceed from primary, immediate, and indemonstrable premises, axioms, that are known with certainty. This set the standard for axiomatic systems in mathematics and physics. The priority of the universal over the particular in science. While the individual, primary substance, is the most real, Aristotle argued that scientific knowledge is always of the universal. For example, A physician does not study this specific fever, but the general, universal nature of fever across all cases. The invention of philosophical terminology. Much of the vocabulary of Western philosophy originated, or was first rigorously defined, by Aristotle. Words such as essence, category, energy, potential, substance, quality, and quantity were formalized by him as technical terms used to structure rational discourse. The ethical definition of voluntariness. A key contribution to legal and ethical theory is his analysis of voluntary and involuntary actions. An action is involuntary if it is performed under compulsion or through ignorance of the specific circumstances. He insisted that only voluntary actions can be rightly judged as moral or vicious, a principle foundational to criminal law. The importance of logos in politics. Aristotle's designation of man as the political animal is intrinsically linked to his concept of logos, rational speech or reason. He argued that nature has given humans the unique power of speech not just to signify pain or pleasure, like animals, but to discuss the expedient and the inexpedient, the just and the unjust. This shared rational capacity makes political community possible. The definition of magnificence. In his detailed taxonomy of the virtues, Aristotle defines the distinct virtue of magnificence. This is the virtue concerned with spending large sums of wealth correctly and appropriately, such as founding a temple or staging a public drama. It is the mean between stinginess and vulgarity, spending too much ostentatiously. The unity of the arts. Aristotle viewed the arts, poetry, rhetoric, tragedy, as being unified by the principle of imitation, mimesis. Whether one imitates noble actions through poetry or uses language to imitate rational thought, logic, the mind's essential function is to learn through skillful imitation of reality. The legacy in scholastic logic. The intricate logical manuals used throughout the European Middle Ages, known as Summae Logicales, e.g. those by Peter of Spain, were essentially simplified and codified versions of Aristotle's Organon, forming the intellectual discipline that defined the medieval university. The principle of causality in every field. His insistence that understanding any phenomenon requires identifying its four causes, material, formal, efficient, final, had the effect of forcing every nascent science, from anatomy to geology, to ask a comprehensive set of explanatory questions, guaranteeing a deeper, more systematic inquiry. The philosophical temperament. The greatest legacy he left to his successors was the temperament of the philosopher, a spirit of meticulous, exhaustive inquiry, an unwavering commitment to the law of non-contradiction, and the belief that the entire universe, from the highest heaven to the smallest insect, is fundamentally knowable through disciplined human reason. The two intellectual peaks. The history of philosophy is often summarized as a continuous debate between the two peaks of Greek thought, Plato, representing the ideal, the transcendent, and the mathematical, and Aristotle, representing the empirical, the immanent, and the biological. All subsequent philosophy has had to define its position relative to this colossal, foundational dichotomy. The master of all knowledge, Aristotle's project was the first and arguably the last time a single mind successfully attempted to provide a single, comprehensive, and consistent rational framework for the entirety of human experience, logic, cosmology, life, and ethics. He remains, in the truest sense of the title, the master of those who know.